I was sitting in a crowded cafe last Tuesday watching a woman at the next table. She looked exhausted, the kind of deep-seated weariness that comes from 8 hours of what she called data coordination, essentially moving digital piles of nothing from one folder to another. But then her phone buzzed. Suddenly, the exhaustion vanished. Her eyes lit up with a fire you'd expect from a frontline revolutionary. She wasn't looking at a breakthrough in science or a plan to end local hunger. She was typing a furious 3-paragraph response to a stranger who had used the wrong emoji in a thread about personal identity boundaries. In that moment, she wasn't a bored office worker. She was a warrior. She whispered to her friend, "I'm finally speaking my truth," with a look of such profound, deep-down satisfaction that you'd think she'd just liberated a nation. It was a fascinating display of our modern zenith. We live in an age where the steam engine and the power loom have freed us from backbreaking labor, only to leave us with a void that we fill with noise. For millennia, the elite kept us quiet like worker ants. Serving, eating, sleeping. Now, we have the megaphone, the platform, and the total freedom to be anything we want. There are no limits. But as I watched her get offended on behalf of someone she'd never met, I couldn't help but notice the irony. We've reached a point where 300,000 years of human evolution hasn't culminated in us becoming astronomers or explorers, but in the right to demand the world recognize us as a deer or a kitchen appliance. We've traded the grit of actual oppression, the kind Gandhi or Martin Luther King faced, for the dopamine hit of virtual outrage. We call it activism, we call it woke, but behind the volcanic rhetoric, there's a quiet, nagging suspicion. Have we finally perfected the art of ruining the world through nothing but talk?
Yeah, that dynamic you observed in that cafe, it really perfectly encapsulates the structural reality of modern activism.
Right. It's everywhere.
Exactly. We have essentially moved from a model of, collective material struggle to one of highly individualized, effective performance. And to really understand this shift, we have to examine the environments where this new form of activism is playing out.
Starting with the workplace, I imagine.
Right, beginning with the modern workplace. Historically, the workplace was structured around a very specific, profit-centric feedback loop. Organizations spent decades building these internal speak-up cultures. They constructed these massive human resources departments. But if you look closely at the architecture of those systems, they were explicitly designed to handle work process or work product concerns.
So like purely operational stuff.
They were built to optimize efficiency, to prevent liability, to stop a defective product from going to market, or just to ensure employees weren't embezzling funds.
Right, basic corporate guardrails.
Yeah. They were absolutely never designed to litigate global geopolitics or personal moral philosophy.
And I think that distinction is critical for you to grasp if you want to understand the modern corporate crisis we're seeing. I mean, think about the basic function of a traditional human resources department in your own workplace.
Right, how it actually functions day to day.
Exactly. If you find a flaw in the accounting software, or, if a manager is violating a clear labor law, the system has a protocol. There are forms, there are mediation meetings, there's a clear path to resolution.
Because the ultimate goal is protecting the company's operational efficiency and legal standing.
Right. But today, we're witnessing this massive transition. The expectations of the workforce are violently colliding with the designated function of the corporation.
Violently is the right word for it, yeah.
Employees are no longer satisfied with simply trading their labor for wages. They're actively demanding that their employers serve as extensions of their own personal, moral, and political identities.
And when employees attempt to utilize these rigid, process-oriented internal mechanisms to raise vast social or political concerns, the systems just utterly collapse.
Yeah, just break down.
Completely. The architecture of corporate grievance is entirely unequipped for ethical debates. So when the internal systems fail to accommodate these philosophical demands, the result is highly visible: collective disruption.
Like the big walkouts we've been seeing.
Exactly. We could look at the historical record of recent years to see this exact structural failure playing out repeatedly. Consider the events at Wayfair, for example.
Right, the furniture company.
Yeah. Hundreds of employees walked out of their corporate headquarters in an organized protest. And the catalyst was not a dispute over wages, healthcare benefits, or, working hours.
It was something else entirely.
Right. The protests erupted over the company's business-to-business sale of bedroom furniture to facilities operating as U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement detention centers.
Oh, so they objected to who the client was.
Exactly. The workforce had a fundamental moral objection to the organization's client base. They tried to raise the issue internally, but as we discussed, the internal system had no mechanism to halt a legal, profitable contract based purely on employee political sentiment.
Because there's no form in HR for I ethically disagree with this legal contract.
Right, so the system broke down, leading to a massive public walkout.
And we see that exact same pattern replicated across entirely different industries too. Like, look at the technology sector.
Absolutely, the tech sector is a prime example.
I mean, an estimated 20,000 Google employees walked out globally. They abandoned their desks, walked out of offices from Tokyo to Zurich to Mountain View.
And that was over his severance package, right?
It was to protest a $90 million severance package given to a senior executive accused of sexual misconduct. Again, this was a workforce utilizing collective action to demand a moral standard from the executive board.
It wasn't about their own pay.
Or look at the logistics and retail sector. Thousands of Amazon workers mobilized to demand drastic, immediate reductions in the company's carbon footprint.
Right, the climate walkouts.
Yeah. They didn't just write internal emails. They utilized formal shareholder resolutions, public petitions, and staged walkouts to force a corporate stance on global climate change.
Which are unprecedented actions.
Completely. The workforce is actively attempting to dictate the broader social and political trajectory of the firm rather than just negotiating the terms of their own employment.
And the documented organizational response to these events is fascinating because it reveals exactly why these internal systems are rupturing.
How do companies usually respond?
Well, when employees initially try to raise these moral concerns through the proper established channels, they face a highly specific form of corporate backlash. Instead of addressing the actual moral dilemma presented, human resources departments frequently pathologize the employee raising the issue.
Pathologize them? Really?
Yes. You have to look at the incentive structure of an HR professional. They answer to organizational leaders. They are not incentivized, nor are they trained to navigate complex, hyper-polarized socio-political debates.
They're trained to protect the company.
Right. Their primary structural objective is risk mitigation and problem elimination. Therefore, the activist employee is frequently reframed as the problem itself.
Man, imagine you were an employee deeply concerned about, say, the environmental impact of your company's new supply chain. You bring this to HR expecting a serious dialogue about carbon emissions and corporate responsibility.
Which feels totally rational to you.
Right. But instead, the analysis shows that the standard corporate response is to send you a training link designed to help you better communicate with your manager. The subtle underlying implication is that your deep moral objection is actually just a deficit in your interpersonal skills. Like, you aren't politically opposed to the company's direction. You just lack emotional intelligence.
Incredible. And in more extreme documented instances, the corporate response goes even further. HR departments explicitly suggest that the dissenting employee take mental health leave.
Wow, so they literally call you crazy.
Yes. They frame persistent ethical concerns as a manifestation of psychological distress, anxiety, or burnout, rather than recognizing it as a legitimate, coherent organizational critique.
That feels like a profound form of corporate gaslighting.
It takes a systemic, structural, moral question about the company's impact on the world and transforms it into an individual psychological failing of the employee.
So the company gets off the hook.
Exactly. The company remains blameless and structurally sound. The employee is simply deemed unwell and removed from the equation.
You know, think of it like a mechanical safety valve on a massive industrial boiler. That safety valve was carefully engineered, calibrated, and installed to release steam specifically regarding operational pressure.
Right, profit, efficiency, workplace processes.
Exactly. If a conveyor belt is broken or a payroll system glitches, the valve whistles, the pressure is released safely, and the corporate machine keeps running. No, modern employees are no longer just pumping operational pressure into the system. They are pumping intense, unyielding moral and political pressure into that exact same operational valve.
And the valve can't handle it.
Because the mechanical safety valve simply isn't built to handle the density and heat of socio-political ideology. It doesn't just whistle. The valve completely ruptures. The internal pressure cannot be contained by standard HR protocols, and the resulting explosion takes the form of those public walkouts, the mass resignations, and the highly visible digital protests. The internal resolution is impossible, so the conflict violently exits the building.
And that rupture has severe, quantifiable consequences for productivity and internal organizational cohesion. This dynamic leads directly to a phenomenon identified in labor analytics as loud quitting.
Loud quitting, as opposed to quiet quitting.
Exactly. Current data indicates that 18% of employees are actively attempting to disrupt their organizations to express dissent.
18%? That's almost 1 in 5 people.
They are not merely disengaged, which is what we call quiet quitting, where someone just does the bare minimum. Loud quitting means the employee is purposefully functioning as friction within the corporate machine.
So they are actively getting in the way.
Right. They are utilizing company time and resources to actively undermine the specific corporate initiatives they find morally objectionable. This represents a staggering mental health toll on the workforce and a massive productivity disruption for the broader economy.
The psychological mechanism driving that 18%, it's rooted in a profound sense of betrayal, really. Well, these employees were recruited with high-gloss corporate materials promising that they would change the world and make an impact. They believed the organizational rhetoric.
Yes, the mission statements.
Right. But once inside, they find that those stated values are instantly compromised the moment they conflict with quarterly growth targets.
And then they're the ones stuck doing the work.
Exactly. The employee is forced to carry the ethical burden of the company's negative externalities. They're the ones writing the code for the controversial client or marketing the ecologically damaging product.
Which leads to moral injury.
Yes, that forced complicity leads to severe burnout, moral injury, and a deep, festering sense of alienation from their own daily labor.
And meanwhile, the perspective of the executive leadership attempting to manage this crisis reveals a profound psychological disconnect.
They don't see it happening.
Senior leaders operate inside what organizational sociologists describe as an optimism bubble.
Optimism bubble.
Right. By virtue of their advantaged positions, they are physically and psychologically isolated. They're surrounded by layers of middle management explicitly designed to insulate them from the raw, emotional reality of the frontline workforce. And because of this structural isolation, leaders vastly overestimate their own approachability. They assume that because they instituted an open-door policy or host a sanitized quarterly town hall meeting, they possess a genuine, accurate connection to the sentiment of their employees.
And simultaneously, they vastly underestimate how deeply these social and political issues matter to their workforce.
Completely blind to it.
An executive views a new corporate contract with a defense contractor or an expansion into a highly regulated overseas market purely through the lens of revenue generation and market share.
It's just numbers to them.
Right. They are completely blind to the moral collision that same contract creates for the 25-year-old software engineer tasked with actually building the weaponized system or the surveillance architecture. The executive sees a spreadsheet, the employee sees a moral compromise.
And this highlights the inherent, perhaps unsolvable contradictions of modern corporate growth. As organizations scale, they inevitably and violently collide with complex moral and political realities.
Because they have to reach into new markets.
Right. Pursuing new lines of business forces employees to question the fundamental ethics of the products they are building and how those products might be misused by secondary clients.
And they're hiring more diverse groups of people, too.
Exactly. Furthermore, the mechanics of scaling require organizations to expand their workforce. To sustain growth, they bring in highly geographically, culturally, and ideologically diverse populations.
So you have way more opinions in the room.
The number of divergent, often entirely incompatible viewpoints within the organization multiplies exponentially.
Which just adds more pressure to that boiler.
Exactly. The structural pressure to maximize near-term profits while simultaneously navigating a hyperpolarized, morally demanding workforce creates an impossible tension.
And the bubble bursts.
The optimism bubble bursts when leadership is abruptly forced to realize that their workforce expects the company to operate as a unified moral agent, a standard no purely economic entity can ever successfully maintain.
So when that internal mechanical safety valve finally ruptures, the pressure doesn't just dissipate into thin air, it moves directly into the public sphere.
And today, that sphere is mostly digital.
Right. And today, the public sphere is almost entirely digital. To understand the full scope of this modern dynamic, we have to transition away from the physical workplace and examine the digital platforms that truly fuel, shape, and distort these movements.
The social media aspect is crucial here.
We are talking specifically about platforms governed entirely by the attention economy, TikTok, Instagram, X, and their algorithmic equivalents.
Right.
You have to understand that these platforms are not neutral public squares. They are not the modern equivalent of a town hall or a university quad.
No, they are highly sophisticated, profit-driven behavioral modification engines.
Wow, behavioral modification engines.
Yes. Their algorithms are strictly designed to prioritize popularity, recency, and extreme outrage over actual social value, historical context, or structural critique.
Because outrage keeps you scrolling.
Exactly. And the architecture of these platforms directly dictates the type of activism that thrives upon them. This environment inevitably gives rise to the phenomena of slacktivism and performative activism.
Performative activism.
Right. The theoretical framework for this is built around the concept of visibility labors.
Visibility labors, what does that mean exactly?
Visibility labors are specific digital actions carefully designed to signal an individual's virtue and alignment with a popular moral cause. But crucially, they require absolutely no material sacrifice, no physical risk, and no sustained real-world effort.
Like posting a hashtag.
The classic, universally recognized example is the phenomenon of posting a solid black square on an Instagram feed on a Tuesday, accompanied by a trending hashtag.
And think back to that exact moment in recent history. Millions of users posted those black squares, genuinely believing they were participating in a massive, coordinated strike against racial injustice.
They thought they were helping.
Right. But what actually happened mechanically? The sudden influx of millions of black squares flooded the exact hashtags that actual on-the-ground organizers were using to distribute critical information about safe protest routes, medical supplies, and legal bail funds.
It actively harmed the movement.
Exactly. The performative visibility labor of the digital masses actively suppressed the logistical communication of the physical movement. It was the perfect encapsulation of the digital void.
Exactly.
Furthermore, you can temporarily add a trending flag or a political slogan to your biography profile, signaling to your peers that you are on the right side of history without ever attending a city council meeting, donating a single dollar, or organizing your local community.
And this same dynamic scales up to the corporate level in the form of woke capital.
Yeah, woke capitalism.
Corporate entities engage in highly visible, precisely timed symbolic gestures that completely replace material change.
Like changing their logo for a month.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A multinational bank might change its corporate logo to a rainbow during a specific month to signal inclusivity, while simultaneously financing political action committees that actively work to strip rights away from those same communities.
It's all just a smokescreen.
The digital gesture serves as a shield against material critique. The absolute dependency on algorithmic virality creates a global culture where activism is aggressively commodified.
It becomes an ad campaign.
It is transformed from a tool of systemic change into a tool for personal self-branding and corporate marketing. The primary function becomes the curation of the self rather than genuine, sustained community engagement.
You know, it is entirely valid to look at this digital landscape and see a massive, shimmering mirage.
A mirage is a great way to put it.
Imagine standing in a desert, looking at a trending hashtag with hundreds of millions of views and millions of individual videos. From a distance, it looks like a massive, unstoppable army.
It feels powerful.
It looks like a mobilization of social and political power that no traditional institution, no government, and no corporation could possibly withstand. The sheer volume of human voices seems overwhelming.
But then you get closer.
Right. But when you get up close, when you actually attempt to leverage that massive digital army to change a physical law, to reform a specific hospital's internal policy, or to force a city to build a new community center, you realize the stark reality.
The army isn't real.
The army is just light and code. There is zero physical infrastructure. There are no supply lines. There is no centralized leadership capable of negotiating terms. There are no material resources to force the opposition to yield.
There's nothing backing it up.
The digital movement generates immense, blinding heat and unprecedented visibility, but it almost entirely lacks the real-world physical leverage required to translate digital awareness into durable legislative or institutional transformation.
And that mirage analogy perfectly illustrates the fundamental limitation of what media theorists term the networked public.
The networked public.
A networked public, which is the specific type of community formed on platforms like TikTok or Instagram, is mobilized almost entirely by effective expression.
Effective expression meaning emotion, right?
Yes, effective expression means the communication is rooted in raw emotion, outrage, grief, and identity performance. It is fundamentally different from a community built on rational critical debate, historical analysis, or sustained pragmatic organizational strategy.
So it's all heat, no light.
Exactly. While it is undeniable that online activism can generate unprecedented global awareness of an issue in a matter of hours, digital engagement without accompanying highly organized real-world action is structurally incapable of achieving systemic change.
The system just absorbs it.
The system is perfectly designed to absorb the outrage without altering its fundamental mechanics.
Furthermore, the daily reliance on these platforms creates a powerful, deeply ingrained illusion of democratized expression.
It makes us feel like we have a voice.
Because you can pull out your phone, record a video, and instantly broadcast it, you feel as though you have total, unfettered freedom to speak your truth to a global audience. The interface is designed to make you feel powerful.
But the reality is completely different.
Right. The reality of the architecture tells a completely different story.
Because the platform algorithms act as invisible, omnipresent, and entirely unaccountable gatekeepers.
Gatekeepers that we can't even see.
Right. These algorithms are strictly proprietary. They are trade secrets hidden inside a black box. Their sole driving objective is to maximize user retention to generate advertising revenue.
They don't care about the cause.
They do not care about justice, truth, or societal progress. Through highly sophisticated practices like shadow banning, algorithmic suppression, and aggressive, often biased content moderation, these platforms quietly and efficiently suppress marginalized voices.
Or any kind of radical critique.
Exactly. They suppress structural critiques that might make advertisers uncomfortable. Simultaneously, they artificially amplify safe, highly sanitized, corporate-friendly aesthetics that keep users comfortably engaged and scrolling.
So the medium itself controls the message.
The medium itself inherently limits the depth, the reach, and the ultimate efficacy of the political message it carries.
Still, despite the overwhelming presence of performative slacktivism and algorithmic suppression, there are highly specific, strategic attempts to subvert these digital systems.
True, it's not entirely hopeless.
Right. We have to examine the genuine attempts to use these exact same behavioral modification engines for systemic critique. A critical concept emerging from the analysis of digital discourse is the digital shame shift.
The digital shame shift.
This is not about self-branding. It is a highly specific, targeted rhetorical strategy. We can observe this clearly in campaigns like Black Maternal Health Week and the broader Black Mamas Matter movement.
Yes, and the mechanics of the digital shame shift in those campaigns are really profound. In these specific digital spaces, marginalized individuals actively and aggressively reject the self-blame that dominant medical narratives have historically placed upon them.
Right, because the narrative used to be all about individual choices.
Exactly. For decades, the dominant institutional narrative suggested that adverse maternal health outcomes in marginalized communities were primarily the result of individual lifestyle choices, poor diet, or vague genetic predispositions.
Just blaming the patient.
The institutional structure deflected all responsibility onto the individual patient.
But using the specific tools of the platform, like features like stitching a video to reply directly to a medical professional, duetting a news broadcast to offer real-time fact-checking, and using on-screen text to provide peer-reviewed data, these individuals are forcefully redirecting accountability.
They're pushing back in real time.
They refuse the shame. Instead of accepting the burden of poor outcomes, they redirect the focus towards systemic institutional failures, documented medical racism, and the structural inequalities baked into the healthcare system itself.
It's incredibly strategic.
Right. They combine intensely personal, visceral narratives of grief or survival with direct, highly educated structural indictments of the specific hospitals or medical boards involved. It is a brilliant, strategic reallocation of shame from the individual, isolated patient back to the massive, well-funded medical institution.
And it is brilliant. But while the digital shame shift is a powerful rhetorical tool for reframing narratives, we must return to the structural limitations of the networked public we discussed earlier.
Because it's still happening online.
Exactly. Reframing the narrative online is the first step, but it is not the final step. If that redirected shame does not result in the drafting of new medical legislation, the firing of discriminatory administrators, or the reallocation of public health funding, the systemic issue remains unresolved.
Awareness isn't enough.
Right. The awareness is achieved, but the material conditions remain identical.
So, If the digital sphere is ultimately an algorithmic mirage lacking physical infrastructure, and the corporate sphere is paralyzed by a ruptured safety valve, completely unequipped to handle moral philosophy.
What happens next?
Right. What actually happens when these modern hyper-individualized activism frameworks are applied directly to local physical policy making? We need to look at a highly specific documented instance of how these theoretical frameworks operate when they hit the cold, hard reality of the physical world. Let's examine the detailed story of Marcus and a local community board meeting in a mid-sized city in Oregon.
Yeah, Marcus' story is a perfect example of this. Marcus was a veteran community organizer, and he was advocating for a highly specific, fully funded, and desperately needed low-income housing project.
A housing project, okay.
The context here is crucial. For years, the community in this particular city had been completely unified in their demand for affordable homes. The lack of housing was not a point of debate. It was a universally acknowledged crisis.
Everyone agreed they needed it.
The goal of the coalition was singular, material, and entirely clear. Navigate the zoning laws, secure the municipal funding, and physically build the housing complex to get people off the streets. The movement was built on a broad, shared material need.
But the historical record of this initiative shows a massive structural breakdown.
It completely fell apart.
The introduction of modern identity-based political frameworks completely altered the trajectory and the ultimate fate of Marcus's housing project. As these highly specific, identity-focused methodologies began to dominate the local discourse at the community board meetings, the previously unified, powerful movement began to fracture along microscopic fault lines.
Right. The community meetings, which were originally designed to handle the complex logistics of municipal zoning, contractor bidding, and construction timelines, completely devolved.
They stopped talking about the building.
Yes, they transformed into intense, paralyzing battlegrounds over identity-based hierarchy, representation, and theoretical purity. One faction within the housing coalition argued vehemently that the housing project's architectural design and proposed allocation of units did not sufficiently prioritize specific, highly nuanced intersectional identities.
So they were arguing about who gets to live there based on identity.
They claimed the entire project was fundamentally flawed and perhaps even violently oppressive if it did not explicitly and mathematically center the most marginalized subgroups above all others.
And while that faction was halting progress over the allocation hierarchy, another faction within the exact same coalition launched a separate attack.
Over the language, right?
They argued that the actual language used in the physical housing proposal, like the municipal documents required to secure the funding, was inherently exclusionary.
Exclusionary how?
Their argument was that the proposal failed to incorporate the absolute latest, constantly evolving academic terminology regarding gender fluidity and social positioning. They demanded that the entire legal framework of the proposal be rewritten to reflect flawless theoretical language before a single shovel could break ground.
And the tragedy of this documented story is the material outcome. Every single person in that room, across all the various factions, was ostensibly on the exact same side.
They all wanted housing.
They were all fighting to protect and house the same vulnerable, marginalized population. Yet a concrete, fully funded, legally viable plan to build physical homes for 200 desperate families was shelved indefinitely.
It just died.
The project died in committee. It wasn't blocked by wealthy real estate developers trying to gentrify the neighborhood. It wasn't vetoed by conservative politicians opposed to public spending. It was entirely paralyzed from within.
The coalition destroyed itself because the various factions could not agree on whose specific, highly categorized identity should center the narrative of the project.
They lost sight of the actual goal.
The common, urgent, material goal of basic human survival, putting physical roofs over the heads of 200 destitute families before the winter, was completely sacrificed on the altar of linguistic and identity-based purity.
It's devastating.
They traded a physical, life-saving housing complex for a flawless theoretical framework that housed absolutely no one.
And this specific failure and the broader trend it represents can be deeply understood through the lens of established sociological models, specifically social identity theory and self-categorization theory.
Tell me about social identity theory first.
So social identity theory posits a fundamental human truth. An individual's sense of who they are, their core self-esteem, is based largely on their group membership. For any social or political movement to be materially effective in the real world, there must exist a superordinate identity.
A superordinate identity, like a big umbrella.
Exactly. There must be a broadly shared we that binds disparate individuals together toward a common overriding objective. They must subordinate their minor differences to achieve the major goal.
But self-categorization theory goes further, explaining the cognitive mechanics of how people continuously categorize themselves and others into distinct groups.
Right, how we split ourselves up.
It highlights the human tendency to focus intensely on the differences between the in-group and the out-group to define the self. What we see in the tragic Oregon housing story is the devastating sociological impact of hyper-categorization.
Because they kept splitting into smaller and smaller groups.
Modern identity movements driven by the algorithms we discussed and the collapse of traditional institutional trust often fracture that essential shared we into increasingly microscopic, hyper-specific subgroups.
And when every single subgroup develops a list of absolute non-negotiable demands based entirely on their unique, highly specific intersectional identity, the collective power of the movement simply evaporates.
You just can't work together anymore.
You cannot negotiate a municipal contract with 40 different factions demanding total ideological supremacy. What replaces a powerful unified movement is a state of fragile and conditional solidarity.
Conditional solidarity.
Right. Groups become obsessively focused on litigating their divergent relationships to historical power, demanding apologies for past grievances from their own allies, and policing the mutual exclusion of their specific trauma.
So they're fighting each other instead of the system.
Exactly. When the entire focus of a movement shifts strictly to how my specific oppression fundamentally differs from your specific oppression, intersectional alliance formation completely fails in the real world. The theory demands perfect alignment, which is a human impossibility.
The paradox of the politics of the self versus the politics of the community plays out exactly like a crew on a sinking ship.
A sinking ship.
Yeah. Imagine a massive vessel in the middle of the freezing ocean. The hull is catastrophically breached. The water is rapidly rising, pouring into the lower decks. The emergency protocols are activated, and the lifeboats are successfully deployed into the water.
Okay, so the material solution is right there.
Right. But instead of immediately executing the material action required for survival, getting into the lifeboats and rowing away from the vortex, the crew stands frozen on the sharply tilting deck. They refuse to board the lifeboats because they cannot reach a consensus on the precise seating arrangement. One faction of the crew argues vehemently that the seating chart in the lifeboat must perfectly reflect and rectify historical maritime grievances. They demand to know who gets the seats closest to the center versus the exposed edges, basing the assignment on complex calculations of historical privilege.
While the ship is literally sinking.
Exactly. Simultaneously, another faction argues that the printed labels on the emergency life jackets utilize exclusionary, outdated language that fails to recognize the full spectrum of the crew's identities. They refuse to wear the life jackets until new ones can be manufactured with the correct terminology.
And time is running out.
They stand on the freezing, sinking deck, passionately debating the exact intercepting hierarchies of who deserves to sit near the bow versus the stern. They argue brilliantly. They achieve absolute perfect sociological categorization.
They don't get in the boat.
They map out the power dynamics of the ship flawlessly, leaving no identity unexamined. And then, because they spent all their time perfecting the theory of the lifeboat rather than actually getting into the physical boats, the ship slips beneath the surface and they all drown.
That analogy, it really captures the ultimate devastating consequence of elevating individual identity validation above collective material progress.
Yeah.
We can trace a direct, uninterrupted structural line through all the environments we have examined today.
It all connects.
It starts with the exhausted data coordinator in the cafe, finding profound revolutionary satisfaction in a trivial, consequence-free online argument over an emoji. It moves to the thousands of employees walking out of corporate headquarters because their operational HR valves cannot resolve the deep moral dilemmas of global capitalism. And it culminates in the total tragic failure of the Oregon housing project, where theoretical purity actively prevented the physical sheltering of the vulnerable.
We must recognize and fully validate that the desire to be seen, to be heard, to be validated, and to have our specific, nuanced identity recognized by the world is a fundamental, undeniable human need. It is core to our psychological.
Absolutely. We aren't denying that need.
However, the analysis clearly demonstrates that when we elevate that individual affective validation above the hard, compromised, and often incredibly boring reality of collective material progress, the consequences are severe and structural.
The real-world impact is disastrous.
We are watching massive global organizations become completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of saying the wrong thing or using outdated terminology in an internal memo. We are watching highly sophisticated digital platforms commodify our most righteous, deeply felt outrage, turning our genuine anger into billions of dollars in targeted advertising revenue, while the actual systemic issues we are screaming about remain entirely untouched in the physical world.
Nothing actually changes.
And perhaps most devastatingly, we are watching vital local governments, community initiatives, and grassroots movements stall out completely, unable to pour concrete, pass laws, or distribute resources because they cannot survive the internal, relentless ideological purity tests demanded by hyper-categorized factions.
Such profound paralysis.
The ultimate tragedy of this era is not that we have lost the ability to change the world. It is that we have convinced ourselves that endlessly curating our digital identities and policing the language of our neighbors is the exact same thing as building a roof over their heads. We have traded the hard, unglamorous work of collective progress for the immediate, hollow satisfaction of being perfectly right, alone.